On November 12th, 1999, the report that I heard was there are 6 billion people in the world. And so we put the picture of the earth with a fuse lit on the front of our magazine, Prophecy in the News. This is the February year 2000 edition. The fact of the matter is there's a lot of people in this world today. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me the population explosion.
And indeed, it is exploding, J.R. This is interesting prophetically because the world, as it's described in the Bible, in the latter days, looks a lot like the world in which we live today, which really can't last much longer at the rate things are changing. Therefore, I think we have another sign that we are right at the conclusion of an age.
The population of our world has doubled in the last 40 years. Obviously, it could double again in the next 40 years. Can you imagine 12 billion people on planet Earth in the year 2040? But wait a minute. If we did not have an exponential curve, if that time of 40 years remained constant and it didn't reduce down to 30 and then 20, by the year 2080, we would have 24 billion people. In another 40 years, by the year 2120, we would have 48 billion population. Now, you've got to admit that if Jesus does not come, this world is in trouble, serious trouble. But Gary, we could take the world's present population and put every person on the planet inside Texas.
And you're talking about 6 billion people.
Yes.
So 6 billion people in Texas, what would that look like?
Well, first of all, there wouldn't be any farms, there wouldn't be any shopping malls. It would be wall-to-wall houses.
Yes.
A tract of land of a normal city block is about 20 acres, has 5 acres, has 20 houses on it, 4 houses to an acre. Just put the figures to it, you can see that every home would have to have 9 people in it, and they would be side by side. Can you imagine the pollution? National Geographic's August of 1996 has an article on Mexico City, which, by the way, is the largest city in the world with 20 million people today. I want you to look at the wall-to-wall houses. That's what Texas would look like if the world was there. 20 million people inside this one community. And Gary, I've got another picture over here in the National Geographics of Mexico City, and you can see the smog.
Smog is so thick that you can cut it with a knife. In fact, respiratory disease in Mexico City is rampant.
Yes. There's a picture here of a baby in the hospital, and it says that people come in sick because they can't breathe. And this particular ward has 15 beds, and it says on the worst day it's full, we still have children waiting in the emergency room. And this is true of a place that has too many people in it.
And you know, J.R., as we look at the Bible, searching it prophetically, which we do here day by day at Prophecy in the News, we look to try to see what the Bible said about population growth. And you know what? It doesn't say very much. There are some verses that you can look at that maybe suggest it, like Daniel 12:4, but thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. That's a possible reference. Today we have just multitudes of people constantly traveling around back and forth in various kinds of vehicles, including airliners. And there are many of them, but the Bible never really paints a picture of the kind of thing you're describing, in which Texas would be wall-to-wall people.
Right. Or any other country of the world.
Yeah.
Now, we're not talking about large cities. We're talking about large states, a state the size of Texas. And how would you feed all those people? Can you imagine the social problems that would be involved? In the Bible, the book of Nahum speaks about Nineveh, which was the largest city in the world in its day. In fact, it had a rival city, the populous No, I guess that was in Egypt.
In Egypt, uh-huh.
That's in chapter 3, verse 8. Art thou better than Populus? No, that was situate among the rivers, that had the waters round about, whose rampart was the sea, and her wall was from the sea. Ethiopia and Egypt were her strength, and it was infinite. But Nineveh was bigger. In fact, 60 years earlier, when Jonah went to Nineveh, it took him 3 days to get across the city, or through the city, or in the city. Somehow or another, it was a 3-day journey in the city. It was a huge city. And listen to chapter 2 of Nahum. And I think Nahum here is a picture of the world in the end time. As we near the Battle of Armageddon, because Nahum here falls. It is the burden of Nahum. In chapter 2 it says, the chariots shall rage in the streets, they shall jostle one against another in the broad ways, they shall seem like torches, they shall run like the lightnings. Well, Gary, that's a pretty good picture of the modern world today.
It really is, and there's an irony here in the book of Nahum, and that is that this populace No that's mentioned in verse 8 of chapter 3 is the city of No Ammon. Well, if you bring that into modern Egypt, we're talking about Cairo. And J.R., I have noticed just lately in an article that Cairo in Egypt is really in about the same shape as Mexico City. Absolutely has no more place to build except to go up to accommodate people.
When I visited Cairo a few years ago, people were living in tombs. They used to be graveyards. They just cleared out the bones, and families were living in those as makeshift houses, ghetto-type areas. Interesting thing about this August 1996 edition of National Geographic's Emerging Mexico, a special issue. Gary, it says here that Mexico City has 16 million people. That was in 1996. Today, 4 years later, 20 million population. Now, to me, this is quite striking, that our world has doubled in population from 3 billion to 6 billion in 40 years. And Dr. Paul Ehrlich of Stanford University wrote a book called The Population Bomb, published it back in the late 60s, in which he suggested that the Earth had reached the point of no return, that the stork passed the plow in 1958. We cannot manufacture enough food now to feed everybody on the planet. And his suggestion was that the arable acreage of land, the food-producing land of the world, which includes, by the way, the deserts and the mountains, could feed 6, maybe 7 billion adequately. Beyond that, the statistics go berserk. You just cannot feed everyone. And you know, we might say, well, science is going to find a way. We're going to be able to solve the population. You know what Paul Ehrlich said we should do to solve the population? He said we should, well, let me read it from page 84. Both government and industry in Japan supported the program of population control. Its dramatic halving of the birth rate was achieved originally through the sanctioning of abortion. Abortion is a highly effective weapon in the armory of population control. End of quote. Gary, this simply means he, among others, was an advocate of abortion on demand back in those in the early 1970s, late 60s.
In other words, that was his solution.
Yes.
And there's no other solution.
Yes.
Well, isn't that interesting when you look at what's happened in the last 25 years?
He went on to say, for example, on pages 85 and 86, 2 bills oriented to population control have been introduced into both houses of Congress by Senator Robert Packwood and Congressman Paul McCloskey. One of them is a revision of the income tax laws to allow deductions for no more than 2 children per family. The other would completely legalize abortion, he said. Neither of the bills seems likely to be passed in the near future. So they had to make an end run around these 2 bills that they obviously could not get passed through Congress. So they had to go around the Constitution and get the Supreme Court to outlaw the laws against abortion, actually making abortion legal, which they did in January of 1973. Yeah. That's incredible. And so there's an agenda behind that, isn't there?
There's an agenda, and what it boils down to is law made by judicial fiat. In other words, as you said, an end run around our legislative body, resulting in Roe v. Wade, January 1973.
There's a lot more you need to know about this population explosion. We'll be back in just a moment. Don't go away. If Jesus does not come very soon, the world's population in the next 40 years will double to at least 12 billion people. Now, there are left-wing groups, socialist type groups, very liberal politicians who are trying to stem the tide of population growth. And they started in the United States, and they got China to get in on this. They legalized abortion in 1973, on January 21st, 1973, in the infamous Roe v. Wade. According to the Population Bomb, a book by Paul Ehrlich, professor of biology at Stanford University, in 1970, in March of 1970, a 2-year commission on population growth in the American future was established under the chairmanship of John D. Rockefeller III. And he goes on to say, hopefully the commission will come up with some strong recommendations. Well, obviously they did. 3 years later, the Supreme Court went around the Constitution, threw out all the abortion laws, and made it legal for abortion on demand. And of course, millions upon millions of children have been slaughtered in the United States alone, much less the rest of the world, since then. He said on page 86, beginning with Senators Ernest Gruning and Joseph Clark in the mid-1960s, there's been a small group of dedicated people in Congress who have been trying to get the government to move on these matters. More recently, the ball has been carried by Senators Joseph Tidings and Robert Packwood, and Representatives Paul McCloskey, George Bush, and James Schur. A few other senators and congressmen have indicated concern for the population problem. So, Gary, since those days, all the politicians who have come out running for president, who have said, I'm against abortion, I'm against Roe v. Wade, we need to review it, it's all lip service.
Mm-hmm. It is, and as you were talking, I was thinking of the words of Jesus to his disciples. And he gave, of course, the 3 famous signs of end-time conditions, one being earthquakes, but 2 of them having directly to do, really, with population, and that is famine and pestilence. As we've already seen in Mexico City, as you lump people together into a high population situation, the medical needs rise exponentially, and so do the food needs. At the same time, you're beginning to cover up the land that would ordinarily be arable land. Agronomists have even warned that in the United States, the expansion of suburbs, for example, around the city of Chicago, we are routinely paving areas that used to be prime Illinois farm bottomland, and those are being paved in order to make strip malls, office and apartment complexes, and so it's happening right here, right now.
In fact, high-rise apartments have become popular in other parts of the world. And you go to Israel, for example, that's all you see. They know they don't have much land, and they know they've got to put a lot of people in that little territory.
Yes.
And so all housing is high-rise apartments, and has been for years. So you see, there has been planning for this future growth. But only people who believe there is no God are trying to save the ecology, save the rainforests. And I'm not against that. Now, don't misunderstand me. I think we ought to be good stewards of what God has given us here. But I've had Christians say, Jesus might not come back for another 250 years. You know, the Jewish calendar is off from our calendar by 240 years, so maybe our year 2000 is wrong, and maybe it'll be the year 6000 by the Jewish calendar when Jesus comes. Oh, screw your head back on straight, my friend. That's not possible. Well, suppose we are able to solve the population problem. How are we going to do it? Let's say that in the year 2100, we don't have upwards to 30, 40 billion. We only have 12 billion, like the United Nations has suggested, because they're going to be able to control the population. Suppose we only have 12 billion. We double in the next 100 years instead of the next 40 years. What about the next 100 years? And the next 100 years after that? And the next 50 years after that, because it's got to be another 240, 250 years before Jesus comes. My friend, the very best estimates, the very best that mankind could do is academic. There are too many people being born.
As a matter of fact, the one-child rule in China has not stopped their population growth, J.R. It's the most draconian situation in the world, and they're still having population problems. Not only that, but when you begin to consider the way the world population is growing, you find that, for example, in the civilized regions of the world, the United States and Northern Europe, educated people are having fewer children. In Northern Europe, some demographic studies have shown 0.4 children per family. That's less than one child per family. Sometimes in the United States, we're down to 1.2 to 1.4 children per family, whereas in the equatorial countries, all the way across China, India, Africa, and into this hemisphere, into South America and Central America, JR, sometimes as many as 6 to 8 children per family. And so the uneducated people are populating the world faster than the educated ones are, which means that the problem is compounded by not only logistics and available space, but by the willingness to solve the problem.
Now, isn't it kind of strange? It's European and Americans that are suggesting, well, we're going to have to control population.
Yeah.
It sounds like they have an ulterior motive, you know. We've got to stop all these underdeveloped countries from having so many kids with so many mouths to feed. It's a self-serving type of situation, isn't it?
It is, and JR, in an article that you wrote recently for Prophecy in the News magazine, you mentioned an article from the Club of Rome, which is called Mankind at the Turning Point, second report to the Club of Rome, and they really mentioned this problem, and they also mentioned the fact that there was currently a kind of a north-south disequilibrium in population. The northern hemisphere having great population, the southern hemisphere having very little, and they're suggesting, well, what we really need is a global system of some kind to control this, and they even suggested dividing the world into regions in order to control population growth, among other things.
Here is an article that came in December of 1999, just a few weeks ago. Mudslides in Venezuela, 30,000 people died. And we think that's tragic, and it is tragic. Now, don't misunderstand me. That's a lot of people, but listen, every second of the clock, 5 people are born, 2 die. That leaves 3 added to the present population every second. So every minute, 180 people are added. Every hour, 10,800 people are added. The 30,000 deaths in Venezuela just put a dent into a 3-hour growth of the population of our planet.
Wow.
And so I ask you, the United Nations, the politicians around the world, what are they planning? How do they plan to curb population growth? Even disasters such as 30,000 people being killed in a single storm accounts for only a 3-hour growth of the population. And Gary, listen to this. There was a doctor, Philip Harter, Stanford University School of Medicine, said that if all of Earth's population could be condensed down to a village of precisely 100 people, He's going with percents here, 100%. Okay? There would be 57 Asians, 8 Africans, 21 Europeans, 70 would be non-white and 30 would be white, 70 would be non-Christian and 30 would be Christian. 6 of those 100 people would possess 59% of the world's wealth, and all 6 would be from the United States. So no wonder the world hates us.
Yeah, I think there probably is a little jealousy working there. Ironically, it's the blessing of God that made the United States what it was. JR, what we're talking about here is a prophetic view of the end of the age. And we're suggesting to you that the Bible does not speak of the conditions in which there would be, inconceivable billions on the face of the earth.
Right.
Therefore, we must be very close to the end.
It's interesting, Gary, that one of the main reasons why I'm convinced that Jesus is coming very, very soon is because of the alternative. If he doesn't come, the world is in for a worse nightmare. I don't know what Armageddon's going to be like. I know half the population of the planet will die in the course of those 7 years of man's inhumanity to man. But if there was no Armageddon, the burgeoning population explosion on this planet will make things far worse than that, far worse. What a thought. We'll be back in just a moment.